think you've been getting acquainted with different approaches to the study of language and literature, and hopefully you must have studied some of the approaches. But here I'm going to deal with one of the very important approaches to the study of literature, that is feminist literary criticism. So I know that most of you are familiar with this approach, but still the kind of revision will take place through this session, and it may be a bit different than what you learned throughout your graduation and post-graduation. As a student, I am sure that you have studied. Some of you might be teaching at different places, and you must have taught it to your students. Now, let's begin with a conversation between two friends. Now, you can see the slide on the slide. So, there's a conversation between two friends. This is a conversation between Captain Harville and Annie Elliot. The conversation is on the subject of constancy in love. And this dialogue is taken from Jane Austen's famous novel Persuasion, which was published in the 1817. Now you see, the conversation begins with the argument put forth by Captain Harville. This is regarding the constancy in love. And being a man, Captain Harville is trying to argue that men are constant in love. So let us read this passage and let us try to interpret it. So I would like to quote the conversation. Well, Miss Elliot, we shall never agree, I suppose, upon this point. No man and woman would probably. But let me observe that all histories are against you. All stories, prose and verse. If I had such a memory as Benwick, so they're talking about Benwick, one of their common friends, I could bring you 50 quotations in a moment on my side of the argument. And I do not think I ever opened a book in my life which had not something to say upon women's inconstancy. Songs and proverbs all talk of women's fickleness. But perhaps you will say these were all written by men. Now, it is answered by Annie Elliot. Perhaps I shall, yes, if you please. No reference to examples in books. Men have had every advantage of us in telling their own story. Education has been theirs in so much higher a degree. The pen has been in their hands. I will not allow books to prove anything. So what we understand through this conversation, I think let us make it a bit what we call interactive. So what are your interpretations? I would like to seek the interpretations from the participants, from the PhD scholars over here. After reading this passage, what are your interpretations? What do you understand? So we're going to discuss these things in our next slide. The first thing that we understand is that Captain Harville suggests at the beginning itself is there is no beginning and no end to the dialogue between women and men. Means feminist theories are one set of manifestations of that dialogue. Means it has been going on. And these theories we need to understand. Of course, feminist theories are the manifestations of this kind of dialogue, and they are not limited to academic discussions only. They are the part and parcel, the blood and bone of life's ongoing debate in all eras and all culture. So it has been happening everywhere. And these two persons involved in the conversation, two characters from Jane Austen's novel, Mr. Harville and Annie begin with a purely personal concern. They are talking about their common friend, Benwick, who has given up mourning for his dead fiancée, and he has found a new love. They're talking about this person. And Harville does not stop there. He goes on to speak of books. We see that he talks about literature, he talks about verse, he talks about prose, he talks about the writers and all those people who are engaged in arts. Okay, and then he moves from the world of ordinary life to the academy, where literature is taught, literature is assessed, and even marketed. So what he's trying to establish here is that the notions that literary establishment is not just male, but likely to be male biased as well. Through his conversation, through his argument, we understand. And women have been historically disadvantaged. And as we see through their conversation, that they have been historically disadvantaged. Now, what are the factors? Why are they historically disadvantaged? Because of education and the books of history, which have been written by men itself, and literature. They have been always the preserve of male. So this conversation suggests that the academy, and even in the academy, by academy I mean is the institution which produces and disseminates these studies, comes in suspect. Okay. And they become the stuff for these women revolutionaries. Feminist approach is a kind of revolution against this kind of notions in the academy. And we see through the conversation between Harville and Annie, this kind of bias is articulated. The historical marginalization of women has been articulated through this conversation. So, whilst being the students of literature, at the same time being the PhD scholars, our interpretation should have such kind of questions in our mind, where different approaches to the study of literature, and feminist approach to study of literature is one of them. So we should have all these kind of questions in our mind. Now, the next question that comes to our mind is, what is feminism then? As I mentioned in my previous part of discussion, that the women's revolutionaries, or the women thinkers, scholars, suspect this production of academy. They think that education has been the preserve of men. Therefore, they try to bring it out of this male-dominated perspective. Now, what is feminism then in this context? Feminism is rather a political perception. And this perception is based on two fundamental premises. What are these premises? Well, so when we think from this perspective, means feminism is a political perception, the first thing that we need to know. And apart from that, this perception is based on two fundamental premises. Now, what are these premises? The first premise is that gender difference is the foundation of a structural inequality between women and men. This is the first premise, by which women suffer systematic social injustice. And the second premise is that The inequality between the sexes is not the result of biological necessity, but is produced by the cultural construction of gender differences. So these two things are to be kept in mind while understanding feminist perception. The first thing is that the gender difference is the foundation of structural inequality between women and men. And because of this, because of these differences, women suffer systematic social injustice. These are the key terms that we need to understand. So they fight against this social injustice, which arises out of gender difference. And the second premise is that the inequality between the sexes, between men and women, is not the result of biological necessity, not because there are differences in their physical structures, but rather it is produced by the cultural construction of gender differences. Now, in the next part of my discussion, we shall be talking about the difference between sex and gender. In the meanwhile, let us understand that this perception provides feminism with its double agenda. The first is to understand the social and psychic mechanism that construct and perpetuate gender inequality. So this perception now provides feminism double agenda. The first one is that it helps us to understand the social and psychic mechanism that construct and perpetuate gender inequality. There is some social mechanism, there is some psychic mechanism, and these two mechanisms are responsible in constructing, not only constructing, but also perpetuating gender inequality. And the second agenda is they want to change these perceptions. They want to change these mechanisms. So this is what we understand by feminism. The next thing that we need to, as I mentioned earlier, we need to understand is the difference between sex and gender. By sex, we understand the determining of identity, which is on the basis of biological category. It is decided by biological structure, whereas gender connotes the cultural meaning attached to sexual identity. So by this, we understand that gender is the product of cultural conditioning. Gender is not biological. Sex is biological. It is determined by biological category, whereas gender is given by culture. It is the product of culture conditioning. Means what we understand by this is that women may be stereotyped as being compelled to have certain womanly qualities. You must have noticed it throughout your childhood that girls are made to think that they are girl all the time. Women are made to think that they are women all the time. Means these womanly qualities are attributed. So in semantics, we talk about 7 types of meaning. Connotative meaning is the product of culture and society. So here, the connotation is attributed. Associated meanings are given. So womanly qualities are given to women, which is cultural conditioning. And these womanly qualities restrict them to a subordinate role. Now let's discuss it with the help of an example of 2 characters. Now, Means I'm trying to give some examples from literature so that you understand what we mean by the, the, the difference between sex and gender. I'm referring to one of the famous works by George Eliot, Middlemarch, which was written during 1871 to 72. In this particular novel, we come across a character named Celia. Celia finds happiness much quicker than another counterpart, Dorothy. Okay, Miss, for her, life centers around her own hearth and home, like that of a much petted kitten. Whereas Dorothy steps out of the role which 19th century English provisional life offers her. Means she tries to come out of that role which was given in 19th century English provisional life by trying to enter the homes of others as social worker and even as would-be architect. So as a result, at our own home-centered happiness, okay, she cannot find that happiness, home-centered happiness. Sex difference, as I said, is the notion of a woman as a reproducer, a biological category. And this sanctions gender difference. What is that? The notion that a woman must set up a family as a chief priority, just like Celia. And if she does not conform, so she has to undergo punishment. So Middlemarch is a kind of society, an imaginary society narrated by George Eliot. And in this society, Middlemarch society, that much more harsh to Dorothy because of her refusal to conform. She does not conform to her role, gender role, I mean to say. And she does not give priority to her family. So therefore, she has to suffer. Now, this can be understood with the example of even Kamala Das's poetry and introduction. Most of you must have taught it to your students or must have learned it. So she's all the time told to behave. She's reminded that she's a girl. And she has to undergo a painful experience when she denies, she rejects to conform. So this is what we understand. Now, as we understood the difference between sex and gender, and we understood that through the discussion that womanliness is culture oriented. Now, what are the biases created and sustained? And what are the institutions which are involved in creating this gender bias? Now, at the beginning of my presentation, I referred to the conversation between two characters, a man and a woman. So this conversation referred to education, history, and literature. These are the institutions. These are the forces. When these forces are put together, they suggest the collective presence of the academy. Academy has all these forces together. It has education, history, and literature. So what we understand is that academy is a collective term. And it refers to the study, teaching, and publishing of the arts and the sciences. And when we talk about academy in the context of feminist theories, these theories go against various structures. And as I mentioned, education, history, and literature work together. There is a kind of interrelationship. Means they try to go against these various structures and interrelationships of power, such as the state, the church, law, and the academy. For feminists, all these institutions are patriarchal. They are controlled by male. And to be patriarchal means to sustain and act out the belief that both nature and culture make men superior to women. This is the bias. This patriarchal society believes in this particular thing. Actually, they want to sustain and act out the belief that both nature and culture make men superior to women. And feminists are against this particular notion. Now we'll understand it with the help of an example. As I mentioned here in my previous slide, that academy describe the study, means it is a collective term to describe the study, teaching, and publishing of the arts and the sciences. Now, when we understand it in the context of one of the 18th century novel by Tom Jones by Fielding, this novel is about the hero's quest for wisdom. And this quest is symbolized in the name of the heroine, Sophia. Sophia means wisdom, whom Tom Jones marries ultimately. Means his quest is fulfilled. Means a man's quest for wisdom is presented as a universal truth about life in this novel. But it does not stop there. It takes on the added dimension. It has the personal dimension, a lover's quest for his beloved. Now, when we try to interpret this, we can argue that it is not universal, rather not merely personal but political. It deals with patriarchal structure of power and the relationship between them. I refer to church, state, etc., academy. Fielding's readers here, we need to understand it in the context of literature. Fielding's readers, both women and men, demanded novels that reinforce the gender stereotypes. Therefore, he wrote like that men can experiment, but women must conform. So this is the message that the readers get. I just mentioned here in the previous slide that it refers to the study, teaching, and publishing. So that is what is taught when we talk about the instructive function of literature. Means his novels reinforce the gender stereotypes. Further, his publisher, means when we try to read it from feminist point of view. Look, these are not my personal opinions. I'm talking about the feminist reading of Henry Fielding Tom Jones. Fielding's publisher would want to give the readers what the latter would like to buy. The readers buy and read. So they were written according to demand of the readers. So Fielding in this context is the writer who creates a loving, wise woman and a man who is eternally forgiven. So if you see all the Hindi movies of 80s, 70s, etc., you'll come across such kind of women characters who try to conform to the social rules, social norms. Look, again, I would like to make it clear that these are not my personal opinions. We're trying to understand how to read literature from feminist point of view. So feminist literary criticism interprets the study of literature, reading of literature, and even publishing of literature from this point of view. Publishers want to earn money, make money, and in order to that, they try to fulfill the demand of the readers. And the writers also write accordingly. So here, Fielding creates a loving, wise woman as per the demand of his readers. So feminists look at it as the structure of power. Here, the writer, then the publisher are together to fulfill the demand of the readers. And they try to compare to the demands of readers. So therefore, this is what we understand by the term political. It operates to reinforce gender stereotypes, according to feminist critics. These stereotypes compel readers, writers, and publishers to demand and produce such stereotypes endlessly. But feminist theories tries to alter this kind of demand. So feminists may go on to teach and prescribe, and they may focus on the inadequacies and of this ideology. How women are marginalized. That is what they try to focus on. If you have any query, any doubt, you may ask me in the meanwhile. We try to understand what feminism is through what we call certain examples of literature. So this approach is generally from what we call particular to general. It is an inductive approach. So in your PhD, while talking about methodology and approach, you may refer to such kind of approaches. Deductive approach, inductive approach, you might be knowing. So we are going from particular to general. After talking about these examples, we shall be talking about the theory. But before I go to the theoretical part of my presentation, I would like to take your comments, your remarks, your queries. So let's go ahead with the next part of my discussion. It is a theoretical part. And I am sure that being the students of English language and literature, you have studied this part. So when we understand it from a literature point of view, our discussion is restricted to literature itself. So feminist literary criticism is known as feminist criticism as well. Now, where does it originate? Where does it come from? So it is a kind of literary analysis. Feminist literary criticism or feminist criticism is nothing but a kind of literary analysis. As we have postmodernist approach, we have structural approach, post-structural approach. So Marxist approach of analysis, just like that, feminist approach or feminist criticism is a kind of literary analysis. And it arises from the viewpoint of feminism or feminist theory, or even we can say to the extent feminist politics. So all these domains are responsible for the literary analysis from feminist point of view. Now, what does a feminist literary critic do? A feminist literary critic resists traditional assumptions as we understood it. Means man is superior, women are supposed to perform particular roles. These are the traditional assumptions. In case of Celia and Dorothy, we saw, or during the conversation between the two characters of persuasion, we saw, and I think Havik. So they try to resist these traditional assumptions and they challenge these assumptions. Apart from that, means these assumptions that were thought to be universal, they actually they try to what we call talk about women's knowledge in literature and they value women's experiences. So this is what feminist criticism do. And for doing so, they adopt some methods. Now, what are these methods? The first method is to identify with female characters. They identify themselves with female characters. And secondly, they re-evaluate literature and the world in which literature is read. So these are the methods that they adopt in the reading of literature. The first thing, they identify. They imagine themselves in the role of the characters, female characters. For doing so, they examine the way female characters are defined. So they examine the way female characters, and at the same time, they challenge the male-centered outlook of authors. Further, the feminist literary criticism suggests that women in literature have been historically presented as objects which are seen from a male perspective. In modern context as well, we do not see the difference as such. In especially movies, the way women are presented means they are presented as objects seen from a male perspective. If you look at interpret various dance, songs, etc., in Hindi film special, you'll realize this. So this is actually registered, this is criticized by feminist critics. So they imagine themselves in the role of those female characters, the first thing. And secondly, as I mentioned, they re-evaluate literature and the world in which literature is read. So how do they do it? How do they re-evaluate? They revisit the classic literature. And by revisiting this classic literature, these critics question whether society has valued male authors predominantly. A Room of One's Own of Virginia Woolf, you can understand. She revisits classic literature, even Shakespeare. And they try to question whether society has predominantly valued male authors. So you must have taught that essay in compulsory English to your students. So Shakespeare's sister also, I don't remember the title as such. So they are literally they try to question the male authors, means how society values male authors, at the same time their literary works. So because they think that society values males more than females. So if you read the essay of Afra Ben, you will have the similar perception. You will come across the perception. Afra Ben, of course, wrote during the 18th century, but still we can see a kind of feminist approach. Of course, it was not feminism proper as such, but her resistance can be understood from this point of view. Thirdly, I'm talking about the different methods of feminist literary criticism. The first method that we refer to is identifying with female characters. The second method is evaluating literature and the world. And the third is embodying or undercutting stereotypes. So they try to undercut the stereotypes. These critics or criticism recognizes that literature both reflects and shapes stereotypes and other cultural assumptions, connotations, as we say. Because in the very beginning we saw, through the conversation we understand that literature and education, history, etc. has been the preserve of male-dominated society. And these critics and this criticism recognize that literature reflects and shapes stereotypes and even the cultural assumptions. So what they do, they examine how works of literature embody patriarchal attitudes, or they try to undercut them. They try to understand how this happens in a given piece of work, even in a given literary work, the same work itself. Now, when we talk about feminist theory and its different forms, actually, I mentioned Upper Ben's name, but it had begun long before the formal naming. Yes, in the 20th century, we started calling it as feminist literary criticism, but before that itself, it started, and there are different waves of literary criticisms. You might be knowing that. We'll talk about those waves afterwards. And postmodernism has its influence on feminist criticism. Now, after talking about different methods, we now will talk about the tools of feminist literary criticism. Feminist literary criticism may bring in tools from other critical disciplines, just like cultural studies. Feminist criticism also brings tools from different critical disciplines. So they may bring tools from historical analysis, historicism, psychology. They may bring tools from linguistics, sociology, etc., even economics, Marxism. So accordingly, we have Marxist feminist critics, etc. So they bring tools from different disciplines, critical disciplines. Apart from that, they look at how factors including race, sexuality, physical ability, and class. Look, we have to understand this. They use different tools from different disciplines. At the same time, they look at the intersectionality of the factors like race, sexuality, physical ability, class, etc. How they're involved. And by bringing in these tools, they may use any of the following methods. Most of the feminists were influenced by, in the 20th century, I mean to say, deconstructionism. So they try to deconstruct the way that women characters are described in novels, in different genres of literature, stories, plays, biographies, histories, etc. If the author is male, there is a particular term, I shall be talking about the term later. They try to deconstruct how one's own gender influences how one reads. So this is reader response criticism, we can say. how one's gender has a role in reading literature, in interpretation of a text, and which characters and how the reader identifies depending on reader's gender. I'm sorry. So what again? There is another method. As I'm talking about different methods, we saw in the previous part that they try to deconstruct the way that women character are described in novels, etc. If the author is male, especially, then they try to deconstruct how one's own gender influences how one reads and interprets a text. If a reader is a man, his interpretations or his reading may be different than a woman. And then, as I said, just a minute, they deconstruct thirdly how women autobiographers and biographers of women autobiographers and biographers women treat their subjects, and how biographers treat women who are secondary to the men subject. So they try to understand this as well. Look, I'm talking about these methods so that you may, those who are focusing on a feminist perspective, may understand how to interpret the text which are selected for the study. Further, they describe relationship between the literary text and ideas about power and sexuality and gender. And they come up with detailed criticism of patriarchal or women marginalizing language. So the focus here is on language. For example, the use of the masculine pronouns, universal, he and him. They try to reject how they're used. And they even focus on the style, the differences between the style of male writers and female writers. So this is again one of the area that they focus on. For example, women use more reflexive language. That is what they observe. And men use more direct language. You can see, she let herself versus he opened the door. She let herself in. So this is reflexive language. Whereas he opened the door is a direct language. So the difference in the use of style. So they try to understand this as well. Further, yes, I'm talking about different methods that they try to bring in. They reclaim women writers who are little known or who have been marginalized or undervalued. Means they criticize the canon. Means they, for example, we talk about the important authors, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, the contribution of early playwrights such as Apra Ben is glorified, is talked about. And they tried to explain how she was treated differently than male writers. So we are well familiar with the essay. Preface to the Lucky Chance. I hope you remember. And the retrieval of Zora Neale Hurton's writing by Alice Walker. Means they try to retrieve it. Further, they reclaim the female voice as valuable contribution to literature, even if they were formerly marginalized or ignored. And I'm talking about the methods, they analyze multiple works in a genre. Okay, science fiction, detective fiction, etc. Then they analyze multiple works by single author, often female. So these are some of the methods that feminist literary criticism adopts. in the study of literature. Now, these are some other. I'm trying to skip that now. After this, we shall briefly refer to the historical development of feminist literary criticism. Look, we've been talking about the feminist approach to the study of literature. Firstly, we talked about how it is reflected in literature. Then we talked about what feminism is and how it works. Now we shall take a historical survey, brief survey of feminism. So the first phase, there are different phases. The first phase of feminism is from 1830 to 1920. And this was a progressive movement. Now, why is it a progressive movement? Because the focus of this movement was not on literature or so, it was simply on women's rights in society. And they focused their struggles primarily on gaining legal rights, such as right to vote, or what we call women's suffrage, and even property rights. Means they didn't focus on other aspects as such during the first wave. But when we talk about the second wave, so in comparison to the first wave, the second wave was more active, more prominent. Because the first wave was merely political. They were just fighting for women's rights. This period starts from 1960. Even we can, some of the critics prefer to call that it continues till date. And it centered on women's liberation. Means initially it was spurred by civil rights activism, and even it was supported by what we call, or it was inspired by the union and student uprisings. But they started in a new direction, with new dynamism, with new vigor. So this was a kind of next generation of activism. Therefore, it is called the second wave. And this was highly influenced by the prominent feminists like Simone de Beauvoir, Betty Friedan, Firestone, Mary Daly, etc. So their thinking has the base for the second wave. And whatever their thinking was, it had an influence on literary criticism. Earlier, it was assumed that women rarely wrote. Means they were not equal to men in any manner, in terms of language, in terms of style. Means they could not write like men. That was the perception. However, the second wave feminists did not accept it. They disapproved this assumption, as they offered an alternative and plausible reason. Yes, of course, the number of women who wrote was very less. They accepted this fact, but they gave an alternative, plausible reason for the absence of women from literature. So I referred to, a short while before, I had referred to Virginia Woolf. So she wrote a very famous essay, A Room of One's Own, in the year 1929. And she gives a powerful account of the social and economic restrictions. Now you remember, she imagines that if Shakespeare had a sister, and if she had all the qualities of Shakespeare, would she become that famous, as famous as Shakespeare? And the answer is no. She imagines all the possibilities. She imagines that Shakespeare's sister is as intelligent as Shakespeare as a school girl, and then she is restricted from going to education school by her parents, and she tries to read the books of Shakespeare itself stilledly, but her parents force her to marry in the neighborhood. So all these imaginations, all these possibilities he talks about. Then she is married off to one village guy, and then she's asked to be loyal to her husband and all. And when she complains, her father beats her. This kind of imagination she presents over there. And then she leaves her village and she goes to London, and she tries to meet the what we call producer, directors, etc. But she's not entertained at all because she's a woman. And eventually she dies. So all these possibilities she has imagined. So through this discussion, she tries to focus on the fact that even if she would have been as intelligent as Shakespeare, as creative as Shakespeare, she wouldn't have got the reputation, the name and fame that Shakespeare enjoyed. So, according to Fiona Tolan, the second wave criticism can be divided into two parts. There are two parts. One is phallocentric, and the second one is gynocentric. Let's try to understand the difference between. This is one of the important waves in feminist criticism. Now, what they mean by phallocentric criticism is the earliest of the second wave critics concentrate on the analysis of the representations of female characters in male author works, and they explore the sexual politics. So this is what can be understood, means the practice of analyzing male authors from feminist perspective can be or came to be known as phallocentric. So you may refer the book by what's her name? Waugh, Literary Criticism, Patricia Waugh. Simone de Beauvoir analyzed 5 female authors in her second six, a famous work. Apart from that, Kate Millett was one more important contributor to the second wave criticism. And in a famous, in a book, Sexual Politics, which was published in the year 1969, she examined 4 20th century male authors. D.H. Lawrence was one of them. And in this book, she examines that Lawrence's use of language and imagery, and even the descriptions of the male protagonist are in contrast to his female counterpart. So what we understand is that this phallocentric criticism focused on the recurring pattern of imagery, the motifs, and language use to expose the concealed attitude towards women. So the critics of this school examined literature as a product of its patriarchal culture. Means they thought that either the female reader was forced to read as a man, but with the emergence of phallocentric criticism, when we say they started reading the text as a woman. As I mentioned earlier, the gender matters. Interpretation just it was influenced by reader response criticism. So we can say the reader's gender matters. So they started reading the text as women and challenged the authority of the omnipotent father author. So this was based on some ideology. So it provided feminist ideology. Means it considered the image and stereotypes of women in literature, the omissions and misconception of women criticism. Okay, I'm sorry for that. The text is not visible to me clearly. Now, apart from that, I mentioned another kind of criticism, that is gynocriticism. Gynocriticism or gynocritics refer to the literary study of women as writers. So we saw in the earlier part, women are readers of male writers. Here, they read literature of women as writers. Means it explores and records female creativity. This kind of criticism understands women's writing as fundamental part of female reality. So gynocriticism is used to refer to the practice of gynocritics. Now, one of the critic from this what you call school, we can't call it exactly school, but who practiced gynocriticism is Ellen Sholta. It was she who coined the term gynocritics in a essay towards of feminist poetics in the year 1979. We saw that phallocentric or feminist criticism analyzes works by male authors from a feminist perspective. Gynocriticism tries to establish a literary tradition of women without incorporating male authors. Okay, so this is the difference that we need to understand. And another kind of criticism is the third way of criticism. So we understood that feminism in American Britain had come out of civil rights movements and socialist politics in France. It developed from philosophical tradition. Simone de Beauvoir, I think you might be knowing that she was highly under the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre. So de Beauvoir's second sex had a base of existentialist philosophy. And this aspect was ignored by the English readers. But when we study the feminist criticism from 1980 onwards, the publication of Elon Marx and Isabelle de Courteswin's The New French Criticism in English, the three major figures is Julia Kristeva, then just a minute, Luce Irigaray, both were psychoanalysts, and then Helen Kioos, she was a creative writer and philosopher, and these authors came to predominate the Anglo-American feminism. These critics are called as the third wave critics. They, like de Beauvoir, they also they supported the thought that male supremacy became natural and unquestionable through law, science, and religion.